CHOREO Chat. Today we are joined by Britt Fishel, and she is a choreographer that has worked with us many times and actually in many different capacities because you've choreographed for us, but you've also taught for our DC Next program. And so we're excited to have you back so our audiences can get to know you a little better, and then actually get to see a snippet of your work that you presented with us in 2018. So, hi, Britt.
Hi. I forget that I work in like multiple facets of DC. So DC Next is such a wonderful program, and I've loved being a part of that and working with your students. And then 3 times being in your show and working with you, and it's been a pleasure and an honor every single time. And I feel like there's been this real track of growth in my work, like through every single time as well too. So it's an interesting progression to watch.
So, Britt, can you tell us a little bit about your background? What has shaped you into the artist you are today?
Yeah, of course. I grew up in Pennsylvania, actually. I grew up in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I grew up only doing ballet. I studied in a ballet conservatory and only did Cicchetti. So up until college, I only did Cicchetti. I didn't have any jazz, any modern. I had nothing but ballet technique.
I don't think I do that.
And Cicchetti to the point where I would go to Annapolis and I would take the exams, and like it was very intense, very serious, and I was miserable a lot of the time. But I knew that like dance was something that was going to be not just ending for me like from an early age. I knew that I wanted to continue it, and I went to East Carolina University, which is where I got my BFA. And when I got there, I thought, okay, I'm going to be a ballet major because that's all I knew. And within the first semester, I was told that I would never make it as a professional ballerina. It's just the stigma of this job. So immediately the modern professor at the time pulled me aside and said, come to my class and join us and let's see like what we can do. And so immediately he pretty much said like, can you do a shoulder roll? Which is, not this kind of shoulder roll, like on the floor, like, are you comfortable with the floor? And can you slide? How comfortable are you with the floor is pretty much what his test was. And as soon as I was able to like get down on the floor, he was like, come on. So that was like an immediate switch for me there, and I never looked back. I graduated from East Carolina University with my BFA in dance, and I immediately moved to New York City. And that decision for me was just like, that's where you go. When you graduate, go to New York and try to do something. So I didn't even think about like any other city as a possibility. I performed with a company in New York City for only about 6 months, and I was just absolutely miserable because it was not what I wanted to do. I wanted to create, I wanted to choreograph, and I really was missing something really crucial in my dance pathway. So luckily for me, I had some connections there, and the work that I produced my senior year in undergrad, which was also mixing projections with dancers' bodies already there, I was able to get some feedback from that, perform it again in New York. From there, it snowballed to another opportunity. And then it just became this thing where, okay, so am I having a season, like a first little season as this 22-year-old girl in New York City? And I ended up like raising the money and doing it. So I feel like that's where like the bones of like me and who I am and what I'm about comes from, because people are always like, you were 22, like what were you doing? But I was like, I can make the money. If I make the money, I can rent the theater. If I can rent the theater, I can have the show, and I sell the tickets and I pay my dancers, and like that's the way it goes. So there was no like flailing around wondering like, what am I gonna do? I just made it happen. And that's pretty much what I try to tell everyone. If you want to do something, you can make it happen. And I had the opportunity to go back to school and get my MFA at the University of Michigan. And so I left Chicago and went to Michigan. I was there for 2 years getting my MFA. And when I finished that, I was in a position where I was engaged. to my fiance, and we were kind of wondering what's next, where do we go? And all we knew was Michigan was too cold. And so where do we go? Let's just point to somewhere in the South. And that's how I ended up in Atlanta. I did not have a job prospect. My husband was, or my fiance at the time, he was able to take a job transfer, and we ended up in Atlanta, and I had no connections. I knew no one there, and I just started over with my MFA in my pocket. And that was how I ended up in Atlanta. So the very first year I was in Atlanta, I applied for Dance Canvas, and I was a no one for Atlanta. And I wasn't a no one total because I had my own company for 5 years. But for Atlanta, like whenever you enter a community, you might as well just assume that you're starting over from scratch. So I applied, and Angela accepted me, and that was my first round of Dance Canvas. And honestly, like starting with Dance Canvas, I applied in 2014, the season was in 2015, and then I did it again in 2016, and then for your 10th anniversary in 2018. And, I spent 5 years in Atlanta making work under Atlanta Dance Collective and independently both. And I feel like Dance Canvas was like a catalyst to like catapulting my name and catapulting like the work that I'm making to the point in which I am now in my career as well too.
You recently moved to start a new job. So tell us a little bit about it. How's it going?
Yes, so it's not even been a year yet. It was June of this past year that we left Atlanta after being in Atlanta for 5 years, and we moved to Philadelphia. The reason why we relocated, aside from family, was that I was approached by Bryn College, which is right outside of the city, and they had asked me to create the screen dance curriculum for their program. So I spent a good part of the last year creating that and pushing it through all of the committees and the provost. And once that was approved, that was when we said, okay, it's the real thing and we need to move to Philadelphia. I was able to link up with Drexel University as well. And Drexel brought me in, and I've been teaching technique and screen dance at Drexel all year too. So it's been this like wonderful thing where I am on the dance faculty at 2 really wonderful dance programs here in Philadelphia.
So with your screen dance background and expertise, now due to COVID and the shutdowns, a lot of organizations and artists are turning online to produce content and filming themselves. And so I'm really curious to get your thoughts, since you work in the field, on the influx of online content, and maybe even talk about any advice you might give as people are thinking about online content or film, or how dance translates to that. Just getting your thoughts as somebody who actually has experience and expertise in the field.
This is a double-edged sword question for me, because I've been 8 weeks now in my house, and everyone has been faced with a really difficult task of figuring out ways to connect with your community when you only have a 2-dimensional space. I feel for them. I feel for our whole community because I'm going through it. I know everyone's going through it. I immediately saw people trying to fix the situation, come up with a solution. You see an abundance of online classes that are happening, so many that you can't even take them. Like, I'm overwhelmed with the amount of free technique classes that are happening online that I end up like not taking any of them because there's so many happening. So every once in a while I will take a class, but for the most part, even though I'm in the digital world, I've been actually feeling like I'm pulling away from it a little bit during this quarantine. And I'll say because everyone is wanting to come up with a solution and coming up with like a way to fix this gap and this hole that we have with dance, it's turning dance into something that I don't really love, actually. And I work with digital dance quite a bit. Like, that's what my MFA is in, and that's what I'm doing when I teach in higher ed, and that's what I do in my practice. But everyone thinks that they can take what they've made live and just turn it into what they're calling a screen dance or a video dance, or a dance film. And that's not necessarily the case. What you need to understand is that there's a difference between documentation and screen dance. Screen dance is not just putting dance on video or putting dance online. That's not a screen dance. I want people to understand screen dance is a technique. It's a technique just as ballet is a technique. And so you are discrediting those who maybe have been like working their whole lives in that practice. It's a double-edged sword, because in my practice, I urge people to jump in and to try and to expand their knowledge of digital dance, because we are moving that way in our society, and it is a very vital part of our practice. But there have been so many people for so long that have been against it and really wanting to separate themselves from it because of this like tactile, kinesthetic feeling that they feel like they're lacking in this two-dimensional world, which there are practices and ways in screen dance to navigate through that. But because they've separated themselves, now they're being forced to come back and do it because there's no other way during COVID. And so that's where I'm wanting to say, we need to take the time to research, to hone this as a craft. I definitely think you should experiment, but you should be learning how to do these things as a screen dance maker learns how to do these things. There's already a community in place that does this all the time. So lean on us, ask us, use us as a tool, as a guide, as someone who can help you educate and get thoughtful work out, so we're not just cluttering the digital world with like stuff. But I will say, if you are interested in screen dance, and not just because we're in quarantine, but if you've gone through this experience and you've thought, wow, like I actually really am taking to digital dance. I like editing. I like using my camera to capture moments. Then I absolutely urge you to dive in and jump into the world of screen dance, digital dance, video dance, but then do your research, do your homework, practice, experiment, and hone the craft.
So we are going to get to see an excerpt from your piece that was presented in 2018. Can you tell us a little bit about your inspiration and maybe what your process was like? For those audiences that didn't get to see it live and they're going to get to see this excerpt, what might you want them to take away from it?
The background for the research of EPOCH, I was working with the idea of this spreading of behaviors and spreading of traits. And so I actually was researching like 3 researchers that work in sociology and are physicians, and doing research on like socioeconomic, biosocial determinants of behavior and health. And so what that means, I was looking at how people spread either health traits, behavior traits, or habits. I was also concerned with habits, and I was looking at them and how they relate to their social networks. And I don't mean their Facebook social networks. I mean their physical social networks, the relationships that you carry in person from a day-to-day basis, be it your friends, your family, your coworkers, people you see at the gym. How does being around all of those people influence you in a way that maybe you don't even realize you're being influenced? So how do those traits, be it behavior, how is health being spread person to person, how are your decisions being made that maybe it's almost inception and you're not even realizing it. And so these 3 people that I researched had really distinct ideas on the cause of spread and transmitting ideas, behavior, and habits from one body to another. And the really interesting part in all of that was that women ended up being more susceptible to these habits and these traits, and it ends up affecting your health and your longevity as a person. And so it was interesting to me to find that out. I had a group of all women in the cast, and to really play on the idea of a single patient zero and how that spread can happen, and then how we are battling individuality versus culminating in the group. So that was the research behind it. It's incredibly relevant to what's happening right now because of how we are spreading disease and the habits that we have. So it's incredibly relevant. And what I had a mannequin on stage, a headless, large white mannequin, and we named her Gladys. She was our patient zero, and she just stood at that downstage stage left corner, and everything operated around Gladys. So they began together. If you think about the dancers as particles or as beings spreading out in space, they separated, they kind of came together, they spread their traits, their habits, their health, and then by the end they kind of came back in and were all infiltrated. So that's the work, and they're all in white because the mannequin was white, and so it was to get them as similarly looking as possible to that mannequin, to really identify like each of them are relating back to that patient zero.
Thanks, Britt. Yes, and I remember the piece so well, and remember how strong the imagery and the choreography was. So I'm excited that people will get to revisit it today. So let's turn it over to EPOCH. And thank you, Britt, for joining us for our choreo chat. It's so great to see you, even though we're virtual. Thank you so much for your insight and your expertise, and now your work.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Enjoy.